Guess what just came into our house today from Target?
What'd you f***ing say?
Boom! Boom!
It's Ryan's World Treasure Chest!
What the f*** you talking about? Give me your gun. What's going on over there?
Yeah, so we actually bought a whole bunch of them to give to friends and family.
What's in the box? Not till you give me the What's gun. In the fucking box?
Look, so many rifles, giant treasure guys.
I know. All right, let's take you back to that memory lane. Ooh, pew.
David Fincher, my main man. Even though it seems like he'd rather make an English Squid Game that no one asked for, or even probably sacrifice his family before making the third season of Mindhunter, he's sick. Hot take, I know, but he really has a talent for crafting these compelling characters and tension-building stories, all while being visually awesome. And of the Fincher movies that I've seen, my favorites recently become Se7en. Se7en follows William Somerset, a veteran homicide detective on his last week on the force, and newly transferred David Mills, as they investigate a series of brutal murders inspired by the 7 deadly sins. The movie's set in this dark, grimy, and unnamed big city based on the time and experiences that the movie's screenwriter, Andrew Kevin Walker, had in New York in the late 80s. It's gritty, filled with great shots and performances, and has multiple iconic scenes and moments.
Detective!
You're looking for me.
Hey!
But the reason why it's become my favorite Fincher movie is actually because of the first time I watched it. Se7en was recommended to me with the preface that it had some plot twist, but I had no other info going into it. And the way my brain is wired is that when I'm watching something, I automatically start piecing shit together to see if I can figure out what's happening. So if on top of this you tell me that there's a twist, I'm gonna start seeing shit that's not even there. Which brings me to the theory that I made during my first watch. What if John Doe wasn't the real mastermind behind the killings, but was more of an assistant to the one actually pulling the strings? Detective Somerset. I know, look, I promise I'm not doing a racism here, okay? Even though not one person I've shared this theory with has agreed with it, I think there's a lot of details that lend some credence to it, so let me cook for a bit before you pull the plug and call me a dumbass in the comments. It's time for me to earn my channel name, baby. To start, although the movie's plot is pushed forward by the killings and their investigations, it's just as equally centered around the perspectives of our protagonists. While Somerset has this distinctly jaded and cynical view on police work and really society as a whole, Mills is characterized by his enthusiasm and his will to fight for his beliefs and goals. And this is highlighted by the contrast of how they deal with dickhead officers during the first crime scene interactions. After a quick montage of Somerset's OCD to open the movie, we see him arrive at the scene of a homicide where he notices some kids' drawings on the fridge. He then asks the other officer who was there if the kids saw it, which gets the following response.
Did the kids see it? Who gives a fuck? He's dead. His wife killed him. Anything else has nothing to do with us.
And Somerset doesn't even bother responding to this. He just continues to stare dejectedly at the fridge drawings until Mills comes up and introduces himself to him. On the other hand, when we see the detectives pull up to the gluttony victim, the officer at the scene explains how he hasn't touched anything, and that they didn't even establish the time of death because they're not getting paid enough to touch that shit, I guess. And we see Mills immediately push back on this.
Wait a minute, no one bothers with vital signs? Did I stutter? This guy ain't breathing unless he started breathing spaghetti sauce. So that's how it's done around here.
Not only does Somerset not share Mills' desire to call out the other cop's shittiness, but he even goes further and asks Mills the following before telling him to drop it.
What exactly was the point of the conversation you were about to get into?
Clearly, being in this environment for so long and being on the force for what we learn to be 34 years, surrounded by people who care more about their convenience than others, has taken a toll on Somerset and his perspective of people. This explains why he was so confused that Mills would willingly move to a city where the conditions are more dire and the work is more brutal.
You actually fought to get reassigned here. I've just never seen it done that way before.
Thought I could do some good. Look.
But what's most interesting about this dynamic between them is that the constant push and pull that's created between this sense of optimism and hope and this cynical, nihilistic view of society is arguably the movie's core conflict. And it's not between the cops and the killer John Doe. It's between Mills and Somerset. The first scene in which we get a more extended back and forth between the two on this comes as they wait for the results of the fingerprints found at the second killing. The conversation starts with Somerset asking Mills if he really meant what he said about catching the killer to the victim's wife, Mrs. Gould. After Mills says yes, Somerset gives a small chuckle and says, "I wish I still thought the way you do," to which Mills responds by asking what the hell he thinks they're doing then. And this is Somerset's response.
We're collecting all the evidence, taking all the pictures and samples, writing everything down, noting the time things happen. That's all. That's all.
He then goes on a bit more, giving more analogies about how he finds the police work to be pointless, before Mills has had enough and just says bullshit. And then we get this.
Even the most promising clues usually only lead to others. So many corpses roll away unrevenged.
Firstly, this highlights their differences in opinion, with Mills having hope and believing that their work means something, whereas Somerset's completely given up on the idea that their work will result in any sort of justice. But when you pair the way in which he says this, and this drawn-out zoom-in on this cold, disdainful look he has on his face, it creates a sense that there's more to what he's saying here. Then there's the sentence itself. He says how even the most promising clues usually only lead to others, which is not only exactly what happens in their investigation of the killings, but is actually a central aspect of how the murders were orchestrated. None of the clues they find are really helpful to their investigation, but just kind of lead them to the next victim, like how the fingerprints that they happen to be waiting for here only lead them to the sloth victim, Victor. And speaking of Victor, the use of the word unrevenged holds more weight when we soon learn of his past. As the cops are leaving for their raid, the police captain, which is literally the only name we get for him in the movie by the way, starts giving a rundown of Victor's history, saying how he went to prison for a bit for the attempted rape of a minor, but then was released shortly because of his lawyer, Eli Gould. So sure, maybe he just said these broad things that happen to have applied to this situation, but it's an interesting coincidence that he says unrevenged right in the middle of the two victims connected to a crime that didn't receive proper justice. And though a case like this probably came and went in terms of news in a place as crime-ridden as the city that we see, maybe seeing how a full sentence wasn't even served really stuck for a cop who worked on the case or had some connection to it. And maybe it would affect them even more if they made the difficult decision to not bring a baby into the world out of fear of people and situations exactly like this. Either way, the real thing I want to focus on here is how we start seeing some of the overlap between the ideologies of Somerset and the killer. It becomes clear throughout the movie that the killer's goal is to highlight both the rampancy of sinful living in the society they live in and the belief that only extreme measures will be able to make a difference. This is why he commits these grisly murders and concocts this elaborate scheme which attracts a lot of attention and is designed to make the police, the ones who should be upholding societal standards and the peace, look powerless in the end. And in the car scene right before the finale, John Doe stresses these exact ideas.
Wanting people to listen, you can't just tap them on the shoulder anymore. You have to hit them with a sledgehammer.
Which is then followed by this.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common. It's trivial.
And while Somerset is definitely not as explicit and as extreme in exemplifying these beliefs, we do see he holds similar ways of thinking. Again, we have this repeated belief that the current justice and police systems are essentially pointless, but we also see how he constantly shows contempt for the city around him and judges others for being guilty of various sins. For instance, during the bar scene after the lust victim, which is a pivotal moment that I'll circle back to later, when Mills starts to call him out for his defeatist attitude, Somerset responds with,
But you gotta be a hero. You wanna be a champion. Well, let me tell you, people don't want a champion. You want to eat cheeseburgers, play the lotto, and watch television.
Mills then asks how he got like this, and Somerset explains how there's a number of factors, but mainly that he's tired of living in a place that, quote, embraces and nurtures apathy as if it was a virtue. Mills tells him that he's no different and no better, which leads to this.
I didn't say I was different or better. I'm not. Hell, I sympathize. I sympathize completely. Apathy is a solution.
But then all the examples he gives seem to be coming from a place of judgment.
It's easier to lose yourself in drugs than it is to cope with life. It's easier to steal what you want than it is to earn it. It's easier to beat a child than it is to raise it.
Though he says he sympathizes completely, he's really sympathizing about as much as the randoms in Call of Duty used to with 12-year-old me.
Oh my god. Oh my god. Dude! What the fuck are you doing? What the fuck are you doing, man? I don't give a shit if you're 5 years old, you fucking bitch. Fucking useless cunt.
And we see Somerset carry this judgment even for those that he knows and presumably somewhat likes. For instance, during the library scene, we see that he's a regular and knows the guards well enough to know them by name and to get let in even when the library is seemingly closed. The guards even have a nickname for him. But we don't really see him interact with them much other than saying the following, where he essentially calls out their sloth.
Gentlemen, I'll never understand. All these books, a world of knowledge at your fingertips. What do? You play poker all night.
Equally, we see him get visibly bothered whenever Mills has an anger outburst, or in other words, shows his wrath. The most clear example of this is when Mills loses his shit on the reporter that we find out later is John Doe. And look, fair, being an asshole to people trying to do their job is an objectively shitty thing to do, and would bother me too. I mean, if there is one group of people you're kind of fine to get mad at, it's paparazzi, but still. It's interesting though how discernibly frustrated this makes Somerset when you consider that he's rarely agitated throughout the movie. And he doesn't go like, hey dude, what the fuck, this guy's just doing his job. He calls out Mills' inability to contain his anger.
Okay. It's impressive to see a man feeding off his emotions.
But there are two aspects here that make this ideological overlap between Somerset and the killer even more significant. How he acts as a sort of teacher, and how he consistently emphasizes the meaning behind the killings. Starting with the first point here, Somerset's role as the one showing the new transfer the ropes actually has parallels with Dante's Inferno, which is perhaps the most referenced piece of literature in Se7en. Dante's Inferno is the first of 3 sections in the Divine Comedy, and follows the protagonist Dante as he's lost in a dark forest. Unfortunately for him, his way out of this dark forest is traversing through the 9 descending circles of hell. But specifically, during this journey, he is guided by a poet named Virgil who represents the epitome of human knowledge. In Se7en, we see a similar premise as Mills finds himself pretty much in hell and has Somerset as this knowledgeable guide. And we see Somerset take this role on rather willingly during his first interaction with Mills.
I want you to look and I want you to listen, okay?
What's interesting about this, though, is that we never really see Somerset teaching Mills anything about their procedures or the job itself. We only see him act as this teacher when it comes to the sins and the purpose of the killer. Now, this starts small, with the first instance of this behavior being when Somerset tries to convince the police captain that the first murder was just the beginning.
When you want somebody dead, you drive by and shoot him. You don't risk the time it takes to do this. Unless the act itself has meaning.
Come on.
And though this is fair, especially in hindsight, he verbatim says this is the beginning immediately after this, despite them only having the first crime scene to work with. And they hadn't even found the note or gluttony written on the wall yet. Sure, the brutality of the murder was definitely a concern and suggested a good amount of premeditation, but there wasn't much else to suggest that this was the start of some greater conspiracy or series of killings. And after he goes back to the crime scene and finds the extra evidence, he reiterates this to the police captain.
It's from Milton. Paradise Lost.
All right, I'm confused.
It means that this is beginning.
And then starts giving them an overview of the sins with the fervor of a college professor who touches himself to his textbooks.
Greed, sloth, wrath, pride, lust, and envy.
Admittedly, to this point, none of this on its own is really weird and can just be attributed to him being a knowledgeable detective. But this is where things start to change. Following the dinner between Somerset, Mills, and Tracy, the two detectives sit down and discuss the gluttony and greed victims. And then Somerset says this.
He's preaching. The sins were used in medieval sermons. There were 7 cardinal virtues and 7 deadly sins used as teaching tools.
While it's definitely reasonable that he'd want to assess a killer's motivations as a part of the investigation to try and figure out what he's doing next, the things he's highlighting here aren't clues for what's to come. By saying this, he isn't uncovering something new. We already knew at this point that the killer is basing the kills on the sins and will likely do more for the other ones. And the way he frames the killer as though he's preaching, which is rather complimentary considering the context, right before he begins explaining the teaching power behind the 7 sins in medieval times, really raises the question of why this is what he's bringing attention to. There's also another aspect of this scene that's worth noting. When Mills chimes in to show the teacher he did his homework, we see the rare occurrence of Somerset being visibly happy.
Yeah, like in the Parsons Tale and, Dante.
You read them?
Yeah. Parts.
And yeah, sure, he's happy that a coworker finally cares enough to go the extra mile, but let's take a step back here. We see Somerset write down at least 4 things for Mills to read. Dante's Purgatory, the Canterbury Tales, the Parsons Tale, and the Dictionary of Catholicism. That may not sound like a lot, but if he were to actually read these, that would be a minimum of 1,000 to 2,000 pages to read, even if you don't count the Parsons Tales separately, since that's a part of the Canterbury Tales. And for anyone getting ready to go in the comments like, I literally read 1,000 pages during my morning shit. Congratulations, and I pray for your anus, but for the average person, reading 1,000 pages would take about 25.5 to 55.5 hours. And considering the smartest person Mills could think of was Yoda.
He's a nutbag. Just because the f***er's got a library card doesn't make him Yoda.
It's probably a pretty safe bet that he'd be on the slower end here. Maybe he's just suggesting for Mills to just skim these books, but we also see how much Somerset believes in attention to detail and thoroughness.
The trick is to find one item, one detail, and focus on it until it's an exhaustive possibility.
Regardless, it's a lot of content, especially for someone actively working to analyze the crime scenes and actual case details. So why even suggest this much when Somerset himself has already gone and read it? An easy answer here is, he wants Mills to be familiar with the killer's inspirations so maybe he can pick up on something that Somerset missed, but this doesn't seem to be the case here. We don't see Somerset start any open discussion with Mills about the books and his opinions. He doesn't even ask him if he read them. He just goes straight into teaching mode. And then when Mills does try to throw an idea out there, Somerset just kind of goes, okay buddy, just sit there and look pretty, dismissing it and going back to what he was saying, again creating this sense that this is less of a collaborative discussion and more of a lecture. And we also see that Somerset is extremely confident in his own intelligence, abilities, and thoroughness.
You're retiring. 6 more days and you're all the way gone. Won't be the first time you've left unfinished
Those
business.
other cases were taken as close to conclusion as humanly possible.
Anyway, throughout the rest of the movie, Somerset has multiple other examples of him highlighting the killer's purpose in a way that seems almost with admiration. After we hear about Victor's criminal history and connection to Gould as they're leaving for the raid, Mills asks him if he really thinks that Victor is the killer.
You're not buying all this, are you?
Doesn't seem like our guy, does it?
Tell me.
Our killer seems to have more purpose.
Then when we see Victor's basically just the human form of gonorrhea and was just set up to fuck with the cops, Somerset says that the killer's playing games with them and that they need to focus on the details.
We have to divorce ourselves from emotion here. No matter how hard it is, we have to remain focused on the details. Okay?
And we see for Somerset that these details are as much about the killer's message as anything else, which is even further emphasized when they're investigating John Doe's apartment.
You were right. He's preaching.
Yeah. His murders are his sermons to us.
While he is right that this is the goal of the killer, the tone and manner in which he does this is like he's bolstering up and validating the meaning. It's also interesting for him to repeatedly call attention to how these murders are the killer's sermons or teachings, when we see his own personal efforts to lecture Mills and the police captain about the sins and their use as teaching tools. And then there's a scene where John Doe's in the interrogation room and Mills tries to tell the police captain that there's something off about him just turning himself in. The police captain just kind of says, well, we got him, suggesting how it doesn't need to make sense why he did it, and in effect minimizing the killer's purpose, which prompts this out of Somerset.
He's not finished.
Nah, he's just pissing in our faces. We're just taking it like idiots.
He's 2 murders away from completing his masterpiece.
Irrespective of the intent, referring to the killings as a masterpiece here, again, reinforces this borderline admiring, glorifying tone that Somerset has as he talks about them. In fact, he doesn't have this seeming appreciation or admiration only when talking about the meanings of the kills. There's also a few times where he talks about the killer's plan in a way to highlight how perfectly executed and well thought out it is.
No fingerprints. Nope. Totally unrelated victims.
Yep.
And no witnesses of any kind.
Not only does he emphasize that the killer managed to do all this without a trace, but he then gives this sort of breakdown of the thought process, explaining how everyone just minds their own business in a big city. A similar and more in-depth instance of this is when Mills says that the killer's luck will run out soon.
His luck will run out.
That depending on luck.
And for some reason, this prompts Somerset to start a mini glazing session of the killer.
We walked into that apartment exactly 1 year after he tied Victor to the bed. 1 year to the day. He wanted us to.
Don't know that for sure.
Oh, yes, we did.
Then when Mills says, fuck him, so what, Somerset keeps going.
Imagine the will it takes to keep a man bound for a full year. This guy's methodical, exacting, and worst of all, patient.
Look, I understand not wanting to underestimate the enemy, but this feels like more than that. With the way in which he's talking about the killer here and in the other examples I've mentioned, I wouldn't be shocked if they did a pan down to his pants and we see he's ripping at least a half chub. However, the most egregious instance of Somerset having tunnel vision on the killer's purpose and trying to get others to pay more attention to it is when they go inside John Doe's apartment. While Mills and later the other investigators are going through the whole apartment, Somerset gets hyper-fixated on the killer's notebooks. I mean, they haven't even secured the whole apartment yet and see that it's safe or they don't have some fucking dying kidnap victim. And Somerset just stands there and flips through one of the notebooks and only shows some urgency when Mills calls out to him. Then later, when Mills is running around searching for some type of clue and trying to coordinate with the other police who arrived, Somerset's just casually popping a squat reading through one of them. And he does this even though he essentially admits there's not much rhyme or reason to them other than being the killer's manifesto, and that it's an unrealistic amount to read on their own. Despite this, he continues reading and then says that they're going to need some more help to read the rest of the notebooks. When Mills says to forget it and asks if there's anything about the killings, which is the whole point of the investigation, Somerset ignores him and just starts reading an excerpt from the notebook that has nothing to do with the killings, but again, the killer's beliefs and purpose.
What sick, ridiculous puppets we are, and what a gross little stage we dance on. What fun we have, dancing and fucking.
But anyway, the most damning part about Somerset's fetish with the notebooks is that we see him ignore a crucial piece of evidence in order to read them. As the detectives enter the apartment for the first time, we see Somerset look at one of the walls holding 4 display cases. A display case of spaghetti sauce for the gluttony victim, a display case of newspaper clippings and seemingly some law books for the greed victim, and then a display case with Victor's severed hand for sloth. But the last display case had a receipt for the torture dildo and a picture of the lust victim, which hadn't happened yet. And so you're telling me that this experienced and genius detective who has more knowledge of the sins than I have knowledge of my own balls saw that the killer has a display case for each of the victims so far and a 4th one with clues to one they hadn't seen, and he goes, yeah, nothing to see here, I guess. Oh my god, no way, he has a fucking diary? And it's not like he reads the notebook for a bit and then tells Mills. He doesn't bring it up at all. He doesn't think to tell anyone about this, and it's not even brought up until what looks to be hours later when Mills asks, "Who's the blonde?" There is not one reasonable explanation for this other than maybe he was stalling. And it looks even worse when we learn that they got to the Lust crime scene only shortly after it happened. And this isn't the only time where Somerset does or says something that's a bit suspect. First of all, Somerset repeatedly speaks for the killer during their investigation, explaining the reasoning behind his actions. For instance, when he and Mills are discussing the Greed killing, and Mills mentions that Gould's chair was drenched in sweat, this is Somerset's response.
Of course. Killer would have wanted Gould to take his time to sit and decide which cut to make first.
Then Somerset instigates some very concerning roleplay.
Imagine it. There's a gun in your face. Which part of your body is expendable?
Another example is during the Pride killing investigation, where we again see Somerset narrating the killer's intentions.
Call for help and you'll live, but you'll be disfigured. Or you can put yourself out of your own misery.
And he makes sure to throw in one last jab, too.
Cut off her nose.
To spite her face.
But in terms of him making suspicious choices or actions, one such instance is how adamant he was for them to wait for a warrant before going into John Doe's apartment.
I can't tell anyone about
Get out of the way.
We have no reason to be here. Listen to me. Listen to me. Listen. Get up. Get the fuck out of there. All right, I'm sorry.
On one hand, sure, they didn't necessarily have good or even any legal footing for them to have been at the apartment, and it would risk having the case get dropped if they were found out. Yet we see all they did to get past this was pay someone off the street to say John Doe was being sketched. And I've seen more convincing performances on F-Boy Island clips than the one that she gives.
Yeah, right. So I called a detective because this guy was looking creepy and shit, and one of the murders, it happened right over there. Okay.
So there was clearly a workaround here, and Somerset for sure knew this was an option, being on the force for over 30 years in this city. And if you want to give the argument that Somerset wants to play it by the books, then how come he says this when he was telling Mills about getting the library reading info?
Wait, how is this legal? Only illegal, these terms don't apply.
Yes, he wasn't intending to quote-unquote use the information directly, but this is still a double standard. This also gives the idea that he was stalling by not sharing the Lust victim clues more weight, since he knows that if they waited for a warrant, it would take minimum hours, if not days. If they had waited, they'd also likely lose at least one more victim, since there was the pattern of a victim a day, and we hear Mills even reference this when he was getting pissed that Somerset was stopping him.
If we leave a hole like this, we won't be able to prosecute. The fucking guy will walk. Now, is that what you want?
Time we go to a warrant, someone else. Nah, fuck that.
You would for sure have to consider the big picture of the case in a situation like this, but Somerset seems to be almost overplaying it. Equally, it's interesting how Somerset fully deviates from his normal calm demeanor here as he tries to scramble and convince Mills to not break in, and then gets visibly angry when he does it anyway.
Stupid son of a...
And circling back to the library reading info that they get and use to find John Doe, the surrounding circumstances of this scheme are murky at best if you take away this implicit trust that we have of Somerset since he's a protagonist. The whole motion of this subplot gets set off when Mills mentions that having a library card doesn't equate to the genius of Yoda, and Somerset has this eureka moment. Well, what if this eureka moment isn't Somerset thinking of a breakthrough for the case, but rather him realizing that he has a loose end that could lead back to him, and him urgently trying to go cover his tracks? Hear me out. We've mentioned how he's a regular at the library and is friendly with the guards, but we also see that Somerset has relatively extensive knowledge of the source material on the sins that the killer used for inspiration. When he reads the note found at the gluttony scene, he knows it's from Milton Paradise Lost. We don't really have a sense of time here, so it's possible he went and researched it, but assuming he went straight back to the station after revisiting the crime scene, and knowing he doesn't have a phone where he can just search this up in a second, how does he know this off the top of his head? Then you have when he sees the scale in a photo from Gould's crime scene, and he immediately says, "a pound of flesh."
Check out the scale.
Pound of flesh?
Yeah.
before he even sees the note, which he reads like it's his first time seeing it.
1 pound of flesh, no more, no less. No cartilage, no bone, but only flesh. Merchant of Venice.
Didn't see it.
There's also multiple examples of him correcting Mills on pronunciations or specific terms for the source material. For one, he corrects Mills on the exact name of the 7 terraces of purgation.
Hey, remember in Purgatory, Dante and his buddy, they're climbing up the hill, they're checking out all the sinners, yeah?
Yeah, the 7 terraces of purgation.
Yeah.
He then refers to the killings as forced attrition and gives the theological definition of attrition.
These murders are like forced attrition.
Forced what?
Attrition. It's when you regret your sins, but not because you love God.
And he corrects Mills in the pronunciation of Marquis de Sade and St. Thomas Aquinas and shows knowledge of who he is.
Marquis de Chardin,
The Marquis de Sade.
whatever, the writings of St. Thomas Aqua something.
St. Thomas Aquinas, there it is. He wrote about the 7 deadly sins.
Lastly, when he goes to the library to research books related to the sins, he goes and picks them out all on his own, seemingly without having to look them up. Maybe he just happens to know all of this from his one research session, but maybe he knows this because he spent a good amount of time with these works of literature. And if the latter is the case, the library might have a record of that. There's a couple of other factors here that would make sense under this lens as well. Somerset says that this guy that they're meeting, who gets them the info, is a part of the FBI, but we don't get any sort of proof of this other than Somerset's word. For all we know, this guy could not be an FBI agent, but rather someone who works at the library and has access to the reading records. And if you're asking why a library worker would go along with this, well, he's getting paid, they're probably boys, and he also mentions that they're square now, implying that Somerset previously helped him with something.
Only for you do I do this, so it's big risks. So I figure we're just fair and square.
It's a deal.
All right.
So if all we have is the word of Somerset, who may have ulterior motives, what's to say he didn't just pay a library worker to go in and wipe his reading history of these books while creating a new dummy account under the name John Doe?
Jonathan Doe?
Whatever.
Additionally, Somerset emphasizes to Mills how they have to keep this quiet since it's not exactly legal and doesn't want to have issues with the FBI. Well, what he's referring to is called the FBI's Library Awareness Program, which was revealed to the public in 1987. Sure, the movie might not be set exactly when it was released, but it's possible it was already public knowledge in the movie, and that Somerset was just using it as a cover story to keep what they were doing quiet. And he probably knew that this would be enough to convince Mills, who had no knowledge of this previously.
You know all this.
I don't. Neither do you.
Exactly.
Anyway, even if we ignore that reach, the library scene in general has a much different feel to it when we consider all of these things we've talked about. Firstly, there's a noticeable contrast between Somerset and Mills during the montage of them doing their respective research. While Mills is analyzing the actual crime scenes and available evidence in clear confusion and distress as he's trying to make sense of it, Somerset is studying the books used as the killer's inspiration with this sense of peace, which is then only further highlighted by the classical music that backs the scene. And we can draw some parallels between this dichotomy and the greater plot. As the police are racking their brains trying to get some lead on these fucked up murders, the killer is always one step ahead and guiding them through, calmly in control. We also see as Somerset is taking notes on the books, the camera flips between an extended zoom in on his face and the pages he's reading, which happen to contain things that are directly used as inspiration for the later victims. On the first page, we see part of a sentence that reads, quote, "his nose cut off from just below the eyebrows," an image that we see get manifested in the Pride victim by the woman who was forced to cut off her nose. The page then flips to a drawing of a decapitated man, and if you've seen this movie, I probably don't need to tell you where this shows up. And yeah, I have surprisingly graduated from elementary school, so I'm aware of what foreshadowing is, but if we take out narrative devices from the equation and look at this in a vacuum, what are the chances that out of the thousands of pages in the books he has there, he manages to flip to the exact ideas that the killer later uses? And there are other more minor things that Somerset does and says which can give some pause on rewatch. For one, we learn that the 7 killings start exactly 7 days from Somerset's retirement.
Well, over the next 7 days, Detective, you'll do me the favor of remembering that.
There's also the fact that John Doe knows about Tracy's pregnancy, and the only person she told was Somerset. Now, John Doe does say that she begged for the baby's life.
She begged for her life. Shut up. And for the life of the baby inside of her.
But we didn't actually see that scene happen, so who knows? And fuck it, it's less fun. Then there's the scene where Victor is left at the hospital and the detectives are speaking to the doctor, where Somerset's first and only question is this.
Doc, is there absolutely no chance that he might survive?
Maybe he's asking because he wants to see if they can ask about what he knows about the killer, or maybe he's asking because he already knows Victor knows too much. You also have the scene with John Doe's lawyer. Throughout the whole scene, Somerset's just posted up in the back looking all mysterious and nonchalant and shit, and he only reacts when the lawyer says that John Doe is ready to plead insanity. He also says that if they agree to his conditions, which are that Mills and Somerset both go in the car with him, he'll plead guilty and sign a confession. When the others hear that, they're like, okay, yeah, sure, but Somerset responds to the insanity threat instead.
If he were to claim insanity, this conversation is admissible. The fact that he's blackmailing us with his plea.
You could attribute this to him suspecting something and not wanting to give John Doe what he wants, but you could also see this as him getting upset with John Doe for going off script and threatening to jeopardize the entire scheme by just saying he's insane. And we see that it bothers Somerset when someone gets the better of him, which I'll discuss with the bar scene. So even though he knows he'll say yes to the conditions, this could be him trying to one-up and humble John Doe's attempt to make a rogue decision. What's even more intriguing about this, though, is that there are actually several times in the movie where Somerset gets visibly bothered by people calling the killer crazy. The first time this happens is in the print lab, where it's implied that Mills says that the killer's whacked enough to have purposefully left his fingerprints in this way.
I say he's whacked enough.
Doesn't fit. He doesn't want us to help him stop.
And Mills responds by saying,
So many freaks out there doing their little evil deeds they don't want to do. The voices made me do it. My dog made me do it. Jodie Foster told me to do it.
Coincidentally, right after this is when Somerset starts the convo with Mills, where he talks about the futility of the legal and police systems, almost like a rebuttal to Mills saying the killer's drugged out. A similar situation happens when Mills says that the killer's a lunatic.
Why do we gotta sit here, rotting, waiting until the lunatic does it again?
It's dismissive to call him a lunatic. Don't make that mistake.
And look at Somerset's face when Mills says the following.
Come on, he's insane. Look, right now he's probably dancing around in his grandma's panties. Yeah, rubbing himself in peanut butter. Ooh.
Again, I get that he wants to make a point of not underestimating the killer, but he looks almost personally offended by this. And maybe it's a case of good old-fashioned Stockholm Syndrome, or because his favorite pastime is doing the old panty peanut butter rub and he felt degraded, but the degree to which he repeatedly defends and practically compliments the killer, and then is actively frustrated when someone calls him crazy, is weird. To make matters worse, when Somerset and Mills are with John Doe in the car, we see John Doe himself isn't even that bothered when Mills calls him crazy, but Somerset is. And this happens 3 separate times in this scene, with him getting more annoyed each time.
Could the freak be any more vague?
And then when Mills spins the block on kink shaming the killer again, we see a similar annoyed look on Somerset's face.
Do you know that you're insane? Maybe you're just sitting around reading Guns and Ammo, masturbating in your own feces. Do you just stop and go, wow?
And to complete the trifecta of Somerset angrily staring at Mills after he insults the killer.
You're no messiah. You're a movie of the week. You're a fucking t-shirt, at best.
But the scene that really pushes this idea that he's taking a shocking amount of personal offense is the bar scene. The scene starts off with Somerset being pessimistic again.
You know, this isn't gonna have a happy ending. It's not possible.
Hey man, we catch him, I'll be happy enough.
But for some reason, Somerset feels the need to push back on this, and then proceeds to humanize the killer.
If we catch John Doe, and he turns out to be the devil, I mean, if he's Satan himself, that might live up to our expectations, but he's not the devil. He's just a man.
It's a very bold move trying to convince your partner, who also saw all the brutality and mutilation-ridden murders this guy was responsible for, that, hey, he's not so bad. He's just a guy. And this understandably triggers some disagreement and leads to the quote I showed earlier of Somerset saying how, quote, apathy is a solution, and he sympathizes completely. Though at this point he's not explicitly talking about the killer's beliefs, everything he's saying here is very in line with what we see those to be, and again, the whole basis of the conversation began in reference to the killer. But the part I left out earlier was the follow-up to this.
We are talking about people who are mentally ill. We are talking about people crazies.
No,
yes.
we're not. No.
Today.
We're talking about everyday life here.
We see that Mills saying this flusters Somerset, causing him to stutter and trip up on his own words, and pull out the ironclad counter-argument, no, but you're dumb.
You can't afford to be this naive.
Then, put simply, Mills dunks on him, balls to face and all.
I don't think you're quitting because you believe these things you say. I don't. I think you want to believe them because you're quitting.
And Somerset doesn't respond to this. He just stares at Mills with this dead, quiet anger. And then when we see Mills go peacefully to bed that night, it looks like Somerset's whole world starts to crumble. If you want to argue that it's the case keeping him up and frustrating him, okay, but keep in mind that he's already seen some shit during his time on the force, and in this case in general, and we don't see this happen any other time, indicating it's normal for him. It's only after the bar scene. And yes, maybe he's restless because he's contemplating his choice to quit, but with how deeply it seems to have impacted him, it feels like there's more to this than just regret on retiring. Like, I'm sorry, if I see someone f***ing open up a switchblade like that and start throwing it at a dartboard with that look on his face, I'm instantly calling the cops, firemen, I'm calling a f***ing bomb threat too, just to be safe. It literally feels like he's imagining Mills' face here on the dartboard too. But anyway, I understand that he'd be bothered since his beliefs were put into question a bit, but the reaction's a little excessive for that on its own, considering how normally level-headed he is. Maybe the reaction is stemming from how central these beliefs really are to him and how much he's sacrificed and done because of them. Remember, we learned that he refused to bring a baby into the world and went to the lengths of berating his partner to get rid of it, ruining their relationship in the process, all because of how deeply he felt these things.
I remember thinking, how can I bring a child into a world like this? How can a person grow up with all this around them?
And it's not like he didn't really care or he's completely over it now. We see that despite still agreeing with his choice, he wishes it could have been different.
I'm positive that I made the right decision. But there's not a day that passes that I don't wish that I made a different choice.
All that's to say that maybe such a life-changing or traumatic experience piled onto everything he witnessed being a homicide detective in this city for that long led him to the point where he felt like he needed to make a big statement because of all that society took from him. A family, happiness, and hope. And if that sounds familiar...
Because I envy your normal life.
Put the gun down, David.
It seems that envy is my sin.
And while we're on this, in the limited time we hear John Doe speak, he does sound envious, but not of having a normal life. Throughout the car scene, we see John Doe give some explanations about himself and the killings, thanks mainly to Mills calling him a psycho, and Somerset asking him questions, kind of like how you'd lob up a scripted ask question to a teammate during a presentation. But anyway, in this scene, John Doe repeatedly emphasizes how he doesn't think he's special at all.
It doesn't matter who I am. Who I am means absolutely nothing. You need to stay on your left up here.
And while he does this, he also stresses how important and special the killings are to him.
I'm not special. I've never been exceptional. This is, though, what I'm doing. My work.
Also funny how Somerset responds with, "Your work, John?" Almost like he's calling out John for taking credit.
Your work, John?
Yes.
And then, after the second instance of Mills calling him insane in this scene, we get this.
It's more comfortable for you to label me insane.
It's very comfortable.
But I did not choose. I was chosen.
On first instinct, when you hear this, it does sound like he's saying he was chosen by God or a higher power. But what if instead he was just simply chosen to help carry out the killings by the man the camera flips to right when he finishes saying this? We see he clearly and deeply believes in the purpose behind the murders, as evidenced by his rant on why the victims deserved it, of which about half was directed to the gluttony guy for some reason.
A disgusting man who could barely stand up. A man who, if you saw him on the street, you'd point him out to your friends so that they could join you in mocking him. A man who, if you saw him while you were eating, you wouldn't be able to finish your meal. Man.
What the f*** is that about, huh? What's up, you fat pig? What, you don't see where you're f***ing going?
I wasn't even driving.
Don't shut the f*** up, you f***ing piece of bacon!
Additionally, we can infer that he was lacking meaning and direction in his life until these killings. So maybe this excitement and reverence he has for the full scheme of the murders is the real root of his envy. He's envious that he wasn't the one who thought of this perfectly executed plan to get back at the world. And in this case, he obviously couldn't outright admit that this is his real envy, as it would spark further investigation. Somerset, however, can definitely be seen as envying a normal life. While he sits and broods about all that's wrong in the world and remembers how he could have had a family and a better life if things were just different in the world, in comes new Detective Mills. Hopeful, resolute, and with a wife and a baby on the way. The life that Somerset was so close to living, but haunts him like a ghost. And when Mills tells him he's just a quitter for feeling these ways, without having experienced the loss that he feels, maybe he felt like he needed to show him. So by John Doe saying that he envies a normal life, he can mask them from further suspicion, while also ensuring that the envy of the real killer and the cornerstone of what inspired the series of Seven gets remembered by everyone. Well, there you go. Now you know why my friends tell me I should be euthanized and donate my brain to science after I watch a movie with them. And do I really believe this is the hidden meaning of the movie? Not really, no. But I do think that the similarities between Somerset and John Doe are intentional and are used to highlight Somerset's internal conflict between wanting to fight for the world or against it. But hey, I personally love the theory, not just because I made it, but because it's fun and makes the movie a completely different experience. So you guys let me know, was I cooking here, or was this just a case study in how far confirmation bias can get you? And by the way, holy fuck did copyright kick my ass with this video. I would have dropped this like a week ago and it would have had more stuff in it, but I had to cut out so much so that Warner Brothers could get outside my asshole. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. And as a quick last note, I really just wanted to say thank you for the support on my first video. I know this is kind of a cliche, but I genuinely wasn't expecting anyone to actually watch it, and seeing the amount of nice things people said was surreal. And I also read through like almost all the comments and have noted all the criticisms I saw, so hopefully this one was better. I mean, who would have thought that not having a mic and just holding up your phone and recording there would end up sounding like AIDS? And for those of you who are wondering, I will also be releasing a video for Season 2 of Severance when it's all out, so keep your eyes open for that, because it's getting spicy. But yeah, again, thank you, and thanks to anyone who actually got to the end of this video too. Drop a like and subscribe if you didn't think I was a piece of shit, and I'll catch you guys next time.
Just don't be jerking me off, that's all I ask. Don't jerk me off.